yeah, we will have a day where you go to your psychiatrist, you say, I'm depressed. And they say, hey, I've got the perfect drug for you. I'm going to write you a prescription for psilocybin therapy. And go and they're cured and can live healthy, productive lives.
All right. Hey, guys. Welcome to Mushroom Talk. I'm your host, Alejandro, where we speak about the psychedelic space through the lens of the mushroom medicine. Our guest today is Tim Schlidt from Palo Santo, is a venture fund that invest across the psychedelic space in an incredibly transformative way. Welcome, Tim. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm fantastic. How about you, Alejandro?
I'm doing great, bro. This has been an incredible week for all things mushrooms and psychedelics, and we're just really honored to have you here because you bring an incredibly wonderful and refreshing perspective to the investment strategy around the psychedelic space. And I know that you and we got connected through a mutual friend. Shout out to Jeff if you're listening. Thank you so much. And I just loved everything that you guys were doing around Palo Santo, your approach, and especially your story as to how you went from investment banking to now being in venture capital. I'd love to hear how that transition happened and how did you get into the psychedelic space, right? How did you come out of the psychedelic closet?
Well, I remember someone made the joke of kind of going from suit and tie to tie dye. You know, I mean, my old day job used to be, it literally was, you know, investment banking. They're on the suit, tie, you know, which even, you know, now in the age of COVID feels so antiquated now. But yeah, I guess I'll start kind of, you know, my background and how I got into this crazy world of psychedelics and psychedelic investing. But started my career at JP Morgan in their investment banking group, in their healthcare group, and then soon after jumped over to an investment bank called Greenhill, which also had a thriving life sciences practice. So always was focused on healthcare throughout my career. And then after that, spent a number of years in private equity, then jumped from the sell side to the buy side and spent time largely in healthcare services. So less life sciences and more that biotech pharma realm and more focused on healthcare delivery, site-based models, clinic-based models, and thinking about healthcare tech even. So a lot of my career was in healthcare, which actually has paid quite a bit of dividends now that I think we're seeing psychedelics go quite a medicalized route versus the more recreational route that we saw cannabis go. And so it's certainly paid off. But, you know, how I got into this crazy world, I'd say it's really was, you know, via that through line of healthcare experience all throughout my career and just my life. I've had a lot of family members who have been doctors and scientists. And I always joke the reason I got into healthcare banking was actually my great grandfather, Arthur Zintek, worked in Jonas Salk's lab. So he helped invent the vaccine, for polio. He did some really seminal research on how it spread. People at the time thought it was spread by flies. He found out it was spread by fecal matter, actually, hence why, you know, kids got it so often during the summertime in pools. But not to go on too much of a tangent there, my grandmother wanted me to be a doctor my entire life. And my dad was in finance, so I had this inherent tug, but always stayed close to the scientific field and always really liked science. So in going into banking, my compromise was, okay, I'll focus on healthcare, but really always have loved the science, you know, loved the field of science, biology, chemistry, you name it. And in particular, I've been fascinated by psychology my whole life. Having a number of family members who suffered from mental health issues, I always knew the standard of care was tremendously lacking in a lot of ways. Always thought there's got to be a better way and just enjoyed reading about psychology, whether it was Amos Tversky, Danny Kahneman, Paul Ekman, you name it. Just that was always a side passion of mine. And then about 3.5 years ago, serendipitously came upon the Michael Pollan book, How to Change Your Mind, about this nascent field of psychedelics. And this was something I had always dismissed. I mean, I think anyone who knew me in high school or college wouldn't believe that I was, you know, in the field of psychedelics now, we'll put it that way. I mean, didn't use it recreationally, but once I dug into the evidence, it was incontrovertible that there's something here.
What was that canary in the mine? What was that like?
Kind of that inflection point. I mean, it was really, the research from Roland Griffiths, you know, Robin Carhart Harris, Matthew Johnson, all those guys who really pioneered this is incredibly compelling. I mean, when you see depression scores, having friends who've gone on SSRIs and family members who've gone on SSRIs and see them lose their libido, you know, have a whole host of other nasty side effects from those, weight gain, you name it. And also for many of them, as many as a third or 2/3 even have it not even work, you know, and then compare that to psychedelics where immediately following a session with psilocybin scores, and the measure is, we call it QIDS or HAMS. Also, there's a number of depression score criteria, seeing that drop drastically from very high to basically, you know, mild to non-existent and then stay that way for 6 months afterwards and beyond, it's kind of that holy shit moment of, wow, like this actually works. It's immediately effective. It doesn't take a long time like antidepressants do. So it's rapidly effective and it's durable as well, which, I mean, I hate to call something a miracle, but it feels like a miracle in a lot of ways. So the evidence was really compelling. And then you dig into other psychedelics and see them being far more effective than what we currently have as the standard of care and say, hey, there's something here we can't ignore. That's for sure.
Yeah, man, that's really wonderful. And you touch on a point, it's like, it's nothing short of a miracle that's always been right in front of us. I noticed something that you shared your deck with me to kind of let me know what it was. I love the fact that you showed up on the history of like the psychedelic stages of where has been, and it's always been in front of us, right? And so, what do you say from an investment standpoint? What does that tell you in regards to the monetization aspect? Is there, as an investor, you have to see an ROI, right? You have to come back and return the fund. So, what is your argument to say, like, between the tension that's like, hey, this is natural, this is supposed to be healing properties, to the, hey, let's try to see how we can patent, how we can generate as much profit as possible, and somewhat mimic pharma, when the whole concept around psychedelics is to combat pharma? So what do you say to that from an investment standpoint?
No, it's a good point. Well, we do forget that pharma advanced psychedelics at a certain point in time. I mean, it was what Sanofi acquired them. I'm blanking on the name, where Albert Hoffman worked, that pioneered LSD and psilocybin. So I put pharma less in a immoral versus moral lens and view it more as just amoral of, there's times when pharma does bad things and there's times where we do have blockbuster drugs. But I will say that can't patent psilocybin and cannot patent mushrooms. Also, I mean, there's no way that can possibly happen. It's genericized. Now, there's anti-generic strategies, whether it's via polymorph form or what we call REMS, risk evaluation and mitigation, which is sort of an implicit IP or method of use. The method of delivery you use, and that's kind of where the polymorph form kicks in. There's some IP you can build around that, but in no way can pharma block someone from if someone grew a mushroom in their backyard, grew psilocybin cubensis and took it, it's not like Atai Life Sciences can go after them or Compass Pathways can go after them. So from that end, I'm not too worried about that tension that in some way block, recreational use. And I think recreational use can be in a very different context from, these being prescribed for a specific indication and really having some stringent protocol around those. So if a recreational market does open up, I see those as complementary in a lot of ways. So that would be my take on really that IP angle. From an ROI standpoint, because you did hit on that, I know this is a little bit of an indirect answer, but it's interesting you bring it up. There are these questions of, okay, the IP position of psychedelic biotech businesses is going to be more tenuous than you normally see in biotech, where a lot of the IP is around new chemical entities. Now, my counter argument to that is, yes, I think the IP position is a bit worse than a typical biotech company you see. But on the flip side, your odds of approval are significantly higher around psychedelics. So that timeline I showed you, I mean, we have over 1,000 research papers across 40,000 human subjects. Now, a lot of those weren't double-blinded research and trials necessarily, but it's a large data set there showing that these are really effective. And so the odds of approval on most of these compounds, I put it very high compared to your typical pharmaceutical compound, which is about an 8% success rate from sort of discovery all the way through to commercialization. So from an ROI standpoint, in biotech, you're looking at high probability, and I put these in there.
Oh, that's so well stated, man. And I appreciate that candid answer. And so, you hit on a really good point. Like, education is such a big thing, right? Like, we had like the drug on wars, we had Nixon, and then it just went off. And now we're entering this new, what we like to call the renaissance of psychedelics, right? And where we have kind of like our parents' generation that are like, no, you can't touch psychedelics, right? Now, exactly. Like, we are now seeing that same generation say, well, my kids are using it. So as an investor standpoint, I know that you mentioned that you were invested in Double Blind, which is an amazing resource. It's a media company that focuses on psychedelic education. So how do you see the role of like the Double Blinds of the world playing a key role in educating the mass market? And how are you guys, from an investment standpoint, looking at education that's not just from an academic or medical standpoint, but also from a cultural standpoint?
It's a really good question, because you have this weird generational gap. And we faced it with our materials too. If you have one group of people who are like, you shouldn't even put the term psychedelic in your investor materials. Like use neuropharmaceuticals or something. Everyone's going to cringe. And then you have on the West Coast who are like, wait, you're saying psychedelic therapeutics, like you're saying pharmaceuticals. Like, no, take that out. So it's been this interesting tension. But in terms of education, yes, we're investors in Double Blind. I think they have a great platform of just covering the untold stories and really keeping some of the deep cultural roots that these hold as well, and not letting us forget about that. I mean, I sometimes go down my biotech rabbit hole a little too deep, and I've always got Shelby Hartman there on the other end to kind of pull me out, which I appreciate that. Companies like that, there's a lot of event hosting businesses out there. I haven't really invested in those from an investment standpoint. It's tougher to see potential return there if everyone's kind of hosting webinars and you name it. But I see that as a really key educational tool. And then the other thing, I do still think, going back to the the biotech angle here, I call it your grandmother problem of how if your grandmother is going through palliative care, sort of end of life or has life-threatening cancer, how do you convince someone like that who went through the Nancy Reagan era to take psilocybin when it would incredibly benefit them relative to any other, anti-anxiety compound, anything they may have in their arsenal currently? And I still think having a drug go through the legalization wave can take hold, and I think it will take hold, and I think that'll be a good thing. I still think doing that, though, you're going to have a stigma associated with it that a lot of people are never going to get over that hump. And we've even seen that with cannabis. So some people still recoil at it. Versus a compound that goes through rigorous FDA review. You show in phase 1 it's not toxic, you demonstrate high efficacy. Having that stamp of approval, I think, means a lot to people. And also the educational hurdle is a lot lower when you can sort of just say, hey, it's an FDA approved drug, rather than saying, hey, let me send you these 10 research papers and these 5 articles and go read up on it yourself. For someone we know in the media age, people veer towards news they want to hear. And just don't even read things they don't want to hear. And I face that trying to educate family members. I sent them plenty of research and they're never going to read it, because they don't want to, versus saying Scott Gottlieb at the FDA, former FDA administrator, prove this, I think means a lot more. So I think that'll be a key tool in getting these over that cultural barrier.
So what I'm hearing from you is like having the signals, the mainstream kind of governmental approval stamps. And so like what
I think, yes, superficially, I think that carries a lot. I can have my own opinions of I wish it didn't, and you're centralizing this with a certain authority, but I do think superficially it has a lot of meaning with a lot of people, just like a college degrees do, or higher education degrees, you name it. It's a lot easier to show that to someone than being an autodidact.
Yeah, that's awesome and great point. Last question on the theme of education and government regulation before we dive into how do you identify entrepreneurs and things of this nature, more in the wheelhouse. But as a VC, seeing the decriminalization in Washington, D.C., seeing Ann Arbor, Michigan, Oakland coming through, Oregon legalizing it just clearly, right? So now we have Florida, Connecticut, Hawaii putting in legislation to legalize it, at least from a medicinal standpoint for plant medicine, specifically psilocybin. Like from a venture capital perspective, we're seeing a bunch of people flock to Miami, right? For this very reason. Shout out to Twitter and Mayor Mendes and Suarez and things of that nature. So like, what's exciting about the legalization from an investor standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think the market opportunity around legalization is probably significantly larger than pharma. I've heard figures stated as high as 20-1 in terms of market size relative to pharmaceutical use cases. So, I mean, the really exciting part of it is that it's just a significantly larger market, and that presents a much larger opportunity. Now, the flip side where I get a little concerned is where do you start to have race to the bottom dynamics? It's kind of like we saw in cannabis. If you have certain areas that
can you explain to our listeners who may not know what race to the bottom is?
Just that the market becomes so saturated with so many competitors, targeting one thing, that it drives down prices, and then a lot of people go out of business, and it's you have a bunch of agents operating independently for their own self-benefit, but collectively it's actually a net negative. You kind of have an externality there. So that's my only fear versus, some of the more biotech-oriented plays. You have some natural protection. You have a natural barrier to entry around the cost of clinical trials. My other comment on the legalization play, though, will be that a lot of that's around psilocybin. I think there's a lot of other compounds out there outside of mushrooms some within mushrooms. We haven't explored Amanita muscaria that much, and you name it, but other psychedelic compounds that probably won't get legalized and are sort of orphaned. I think LSD carries a lot more stigma around it still than psilocybin does. So there's a lot of opportunity, around those more in the biotech world, certainly. But I'll cap that off with saying I welcome legalization. I personally think that with pharmaceutical models will complement each other, that someone can go through a 1 or 2 time treatment. And then if you want to explore your consciousness more deeply or go to a retreat center or do it in a more recreational sense, that'll be open. And in a lot of ways, you get the best of both worlds, is how I'm viewing it as an investor.
What's your standpoint on the importance of integration and like doing the integration protocols and the exercises that are needed?
It's interesting because on one end, it makes it so cost prohibitive to have all this psychotherapy and all this integration and everything that that's the current protocol most of these are being advanced with. So from a market standpoint, you like to hear it when something can be offered, at a lesser cost for patients, and that makes it more affordable and more accessible for people. And I think that, very much so for the greater good. So that's on one end. At the same time, though, clinical outcomes are definitely associated with integration. And so if that's what we're going for, a true remission, I think it's important. Now, I think there's probably areas where we can tinker with, and we'll slowly find that, of ways to reduce how many psychotherapy hours go into this, how many doses you have to take, you name it. I think there's an abundance of caution mentality with sort of this first generation of psychedelics. And over the coming years, that's going to get chiseled away at over time. But for now, I'll toe the party line and say that I agree it's important. And there's, you can't just hedonistically take a drug and hope for the best. I think there's probably a lot more to it from a psychoanalytic angle. And so, I do think it's important.
A powerful answer. Thanks, Tim. And switching gears now to a more entrepreneurial focus. What are some of the key traits that you look at from a founder perspective? Because I know you guys invest in pre-seed, seed, Series A. You guys invest in the whole spectrum all the way through growth stage. So, like walk me through your process of identifying a great founder at a pre-seed, seed, Series A.
I mean, a lot of it is team. At the end of the day, it really does come down to the founder, and there's a lot of sniff tests. I think you can test people out pretty quickly, whether they know what they're talking about or not, especially in the biotech world. It's such a regulatorily complex domain that when you have people entering from the outside, I don't dismiss them. I think everyone's got to get heard out. But, if you're not coming from some sort of a pharmaceutical healthcare background, it's a lot tougher. I think it's tougher to enter this world and in 6 months learn everything you need to know to start a biotech business necessarily, unless you're backed by the right advisors. So first thing is the core team. What's their background? I really like to see people with some sort of pharmaceutical experience or biotech experience, their advisors, and understanding how involved their advisors are, their area of research and expertise, and how applicable that is.
And how important is advisors, like the role that they play within a newcomer into the space?
I'd say pretty darn important. I mean, that's especially if they're advancing some of that advisor's research. I mean, really understanding their involvement is important. So we're investors, and we're seed investors, and we led the round on a company called Reset Pharma, which is advancing Stephen Ross's seminal research on psilocybin for cancer-related depression. And that was a big diligence topic, was, okay, your licensing is research. How involved is Stephen Ross? How active is he going to be? I mean, he really was core to that program, and, making sure that he's going to continue leading that through, phase 2B and into phase 3. So it's definitely important. And then the last thing I'd say we want to tease out is the science. I mean, trying to get a pretty good understanding of, is there precedent for this drug for the indication you're trying to target? And if there's not much I can find out there in the public domain, understanding that mechanism of action, is there, what do you have? And what, are there animal behavioral studies, assays you can show, you name it, to at least give a glimmer of why. And it could even come down to anecdote. I mean, I know one company that did a whole scrub of Erowid and realized, holy crap, we can combine a benzodiazepine with psilocybin, and it's actually incredibly effective in mitigating anxiety and nausea, you name it. But at least some data point, rather than kind of taking a shot in the dark. Or I think there's some companies who just want to have something, then they'll go public, they'll get a stock price pop, make a ton of money, and it feels more like a pump and dump. But I want to make sure under the hood there's something real.
Checking under the hood, how important is the character? What do you guys look for in character of the founder or the founding team? Like, what are the non-qualitative things that you guys look for?
So it's a really good question. I mean, you want to avoid a Steph Curry type situation at Away, make sure they're not, don't drive their employees bonkers. So there's headline risk, of course, and you're trying to assess that. B, we do background checking. We talk to people in our, in our milieu and try to find people who know that person. We actually did have an opportunity that we were incredibly intrigued by and did quite a bit of work on, and then surfaced, there were just ethical concerns around the founder, and we did walk away. And it probably would have been a good opportunity, and I'm sure, and I'm sure they're going to make a lot of money. But it's not worth the risk. And I think you have to, to your point, there's qualitative aspects to investing, not just quantitative. And if you're focused purely on return, you're going to lose your soul in this world. So definitely.
Yeah, man. Quick rapid fire. What are some 3 strengths that you see on founders that are just like, let me double down? And what are 3 weaknesses that you're just like, I know you mentioned ethical, but what are 3 other weaknesses that you see that you're just like, this is not, I'm not going to touch it?
Yeah. 3 strengths are scientific background, being able to speak to many facets of their program, the science behind the compound, the pharmacology, their plans for clinical trial design, their plans for commercialization, having that, having a systemic view of that and really, showing thoughtfulness. And then third, I'd say is demonstrating an ability to manage people as well. That they can, as you're growing an organization, being able to manage many different people. This is very complex in terms of advancing a compound through clinical trials and through to commercialization, and making sure that someone can oversee that and delegate efficiently and all those factors. That's off the top of my mind. Maybe I'll think of more. In terms of negatives, I would say, ethics, without a doubt. If there's ethical concerns, you just walk away. And I learned that from my days at Madison Dearborn Partners. Even we had another opportunity we looked at really, really good, and they actually made a ton of money through COVID, but we just said no. You just not where it was kind of, Harvey Weinstein level risk we're talking, and we're just like, no, you don't. Yeah, no, it was bad. So you don't touch it. So that's certainly one. In terms of others, cluelessness or kind of that cowboy nature of just sometimes you talk to people who are, I think you get the sense they're just slapping psychedelic on and they know it's going to get a valuation premium. But again, the moment you just start poking at things, you realize that they really, there's just not a lot there. And then, I guess I'd say, if it's a very tangential background and they're trying to step into biotech, I struggle. The barrier is a lot higher. And I'd put that, at least in this domain. I think there's other industries where you can sort of stumble in. And I think there's some benefit to maybe, not, to being an outsider and rethinking things. In biotech, that's a bit tougher. In biotech, you usually see the most successful entrepreneurs being very seasoned and having been in this space for quite some time. So if someone's really a true outsider and doesn't have much of a team around them, I struggle with that. So it's a weakness, I'd say, but that's in terms of what comes to mind. I'd put that in the third category.
That's a powerful list, Tim. Thanks for that, man. And so now just kind of flowing through the end of our conversation here, just a couple personal questions. What has been your personal experience with psychedelics, right? It's like Paul Stamets has always been saying like, he gets calls and then he's like, yo, have you tried it? And they're like, no, we just see the opportunity. You got to talk to us a little bit about your personal experience. And if you want,
I know
as much as you're comfortable here.
Yeah, totally. No, well, it's interesting. We had looked at, I was helping my business partner, and initially when he was looking at getting into the space, we looked at seeding another fund because he runs a VC firm. And we were like, okay, who do we just park our money with and have them manage it? And met with another fund sort of focused on it, and immediately heard, when we started digging into it and talking about our own experiences and started asking them, well, what about you guys? Like what has yours been? And got the answer, oh no, we haven't tried it yet. We haven't done this. It was like, wait, how do you? And I had this conversation with the CEO of one of our portfolio companies also, who we're very tight with. And we were just like, how do you get into this space without ever having tried these compounds? It just kind of blows my mind, or at least, I can see you being a passive investor, but if you're like active in the space, I don't know, I'm always surprised because having, experimented a bit and tried them in a safe setting, of course, gives you a lot of perspective. And so, yeah, I have admittedly used these in very safe settings and always with the guide, which I think is incredibly important. I've seen cases where trips can go south, and I think we still have to appreciate the psychoactive nature of these, especially at incredibly high doses. And just to support the movement, to de-risk it for other people and not crap on the parade for everyone else. You don't want to be the guy who has the bad trip and goes crazy and pushes these underground again, and there's this headline risk. So just for that, I always
Right.
have guide in place, but have admittedly worked with psilocybin. I say this 5-MeO DMT I think is incredibly profound as well, and there's not a lot of data around it, but you've got to believe there's some therapeutic efficacy there. Have also did ketamine, which is certainly above ground in terms of that use, and have worked with a number of other ones, of course, LSD. As well. I think that's very common, and especially in a microdose setting, it's a very interesting one. So I do have to give the advice to other people, don't try this at home or, do it in a legal setting and all the normal caveats. But I think it's given me a unique perspective where when you talk to a company advancing something, and I forgot to mention MDMA. How can I forget it? I mean, that's a lovely, lovely pro-social drug and lovely entactogen, and actually 2CB, interestingly enough. That was very interesting. But so it's always a weird position I'm in to, you don't want to sound like the kook who's like a druggie and everything. And I know Harriet
Right.
always speaks about this in her podcast. So she always doesn't want to say she's done these, because then you sound like the proselytizer and telling everyone, oh, you got to try this. I wouldn't put myself in that camp. I do think, proceed with caution and have a guide and understand the science. And for some of these, they can be dangerous. In the case of 5-MeO DMT, there's risk around that. And definitely Ibogaine, which I have not tried, but there's HERG risk. So there's cardiovascular risk to that. But I know there's that angle. But I think at the same time, going into this, there's got to be some admission that you've done some work. And it just gives you a unique perspective. When I talk to a company and they're trying to advance a certain compound for a certain disease, I can definitely sometimes just through personal experience say, okay, yeah, I see that, or no, I don't. Like MDMA for couples counseling, there probably could be something there down the road.
Dude, I appreciate the empathy that you bring and the consciousness to the approach of you experimenting and sitting with these compounds, because they're so powerful. And bringing that empathy to that, it's like great leadership. I just want to highlight that, because so many different people, so many people are just like, oh yeah, it was super cool, super great. Like they make it more recreational. So I appreciate the consciousness that you bring.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, as a quick aside, sorry not to interject. It is interesting. You have these two camps where one is in, friends I talk to who kind of learn I'm in this field for the first time. It's like, oh yeah, I like go to a concert or something and I trip or take acid. And it's very like, it's more pro-social and just kind of trippy and maybe a little hedonistic. And then there's the other camp of like deep inner work. Most of the time, almost every time I've worked with these, it's always been more of the deep inner work side. I mean, sit with the guide, really go inward, some deep processing and healing. But it's not to poo-poo the more recreational and kind of fun use cases, but it's just interesting that there's two sides. I'd say I veer on the more kind of psychoanalytic camp of this, which maybe is boring. I'm probably a boring person to trip with because I put my eye mask on and go pretty deep.
You just go deep in, with that intentional.
I become a little Buddha, but yeah, that's,
I could just imagine you like in Buddha style sitting there, just like
I've been there and just like total.
That's wonderful, brother.
Total bliss, but yeah.
Oh, I love that, man, and thank you so much for I feel like the way that you've explained it, it's almost bringing permission for others, to our listeners, to kind of explore that in a safe way, right? And we'll put resources on the show notes as to how to do things safely and things of that nature, and we'll talk about different concepts and show links to a bunch of different websites that show you how to proactively do this in a safe space and setting. Not to say that we're promoting drug use, but in the case that you're already there, there's going to be these guides.
Agreed. That would be my definitive caveat is, that these aren't legal and so, but if that's, and I can't recommend anyone use them, I can state, what has happened.
Personal use,
yeah. But if you are at that tipping point, definitely take precautions, definitely have a guide in place, all those normal things. And I think I'm within decent bounds of saying that Tim Ferriss has talked about this, Joe Rogan. So,
and we're speaking about it now. I've spoken about my own psychedelic journeys, sitting with ayahuasca, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD. I think it's important to really destigmatize it, because it is just, we are
yes,
people who are creating value in society. We are creating value for beyond ourselves and creating net positive impact for society. And this is just
yeah,
to say that it's just an agreement that we as a society may have been misguided in the 60s and 70s to have put this down as a scheduled one, right?
yeah.
And it
I
definitely
totally agree.
is. Because like if you think about it, like psilocybin, I think the Imperial College of London did a study in early 2010s, and they came out saying that like alcohol is actually the most dangerous
Yeah,
compound
that
there
was
is,
David
and
Nutt.
like and then like mushrooms are like the least harmful one. And like it's just like, okay,
Well,
cool.
anyone who's tried mushrooms too, like it's tough to fathom how that you'd ever harm another person or on mush. Like I just can't. Well, versus alcohol, I can see how someone or gets angry
It
at
destroys
something else.
families, right? So to
Oh,
that
totally.
point, brother,
Yeah,
how do you see psychedelics in 5 years? So we're closing our eyes. We're 5 years ahead.
yeah.
What does Tim see in the space in form of education, media, biotech, and distribution for the consumer?
Yeah, definitely. Before I hit on that, just hitting on your last point to cap that off. I think what you were saying about personal use, my biggest thing, if I could promote it here, would be if someone's tried these, where we really need to move to as a culture is, not everyone needs to or should even try these. We know that, especially for, people with certain mental illnesses. But I think we do need to stop drug shaming people. I think we need to stop
Mm.
have, and I'm that would be my final thought there. Sorry, not to answer the
Now
question.
that's a great final thought, man. Like drug
Yeah,
shaming is very real, and I'm
yeah,
glad that you brought that up.
I think it's no one should be peer pressured on on the other end of the spectrum, but there's so much shaming around it of like, oh, you tried that or you tried, and there's also there's kind of superiority complexes of, oh well, I do still I do ayahuasca, but I don't do other things, and everyone has different drugs that work for them well. So yeah, no shaming. In terms of where I see psychedelics 5 years from now, I think about this a lot because you're trying to spot the trends and the big waves, and it is this question of, is it going to be where we stand now is the better play on the biotech side, or is it making a long shot bet on legalization that does play out and that's de-risked enough? My view is, I think that I'll speak about it in terms of dominoes I see falling. I think the first domino will be psychedelics in a bit more of a pharmaceutical context. That's just, there's so much momentum and capital around that you'll have these first generation psychedelics, largely genericized forms, being advanced, and being commercialized by biotech businesses. And those will start to go mainstream. I mean, we'll have MDMA hit the market probably in 2022. Once MAPS phase 3 trials are done, Compass Pathways, I believe 2023, 2024, they'll likely be wrapped up. COVID has delayed that a bit, but you probably see that hitting the market by 2025. So that's kind of 5 years from now. And then some others in the wings that are in phase 2 now. You'll probably start seeing those roll out as commercial offerings starting 2025. From there, I then think an ecosystem of clinics will really start to emerge and take hold. And I see that becoming an investable universe. So sort of this clinical infrastructure, a tech infrastructure that overlays that, really becomes economically viable at that point. Once you have real products and therapies to offer, that makes it a lot more viable. There's people positioning now, but it's still pretty nascent.
Mm-hmm.
Then from there, I think once consumers, and I spoke to the grandma problem and all that, really start to get comfortable with these, I really think legalization starts to take hold. And the prospect of even maybe federal legalization more in the next decade becomes feasible and conceivable. But I see that probably beyond the 5 year mark. I think there's going to continue to be states that percolate in certain cities that decriminalize it, but they're decriminalized, but it still makes commercial enterprise incredibly difficult still. Even, you can't start a business in Ann Arbor or DC. You can grow mushrooms in your flower pot or whatever, but it's going to be tough to start a dispensary.
Do you think that we're going to start seeing more doctors prescribe psilocybin instead of SSRIs and antidepressants for dosing?
It's the $1 million question. I think it depends on what the rollout looks like. I mean, we had a lot of hope around esketamine, Janssen's esketamine, or Johnson and Johnson. They're the Janssen is their subsidiary, and then we realized the commercial rollout of that was much more difficult than we thought. There was such an onerous REMS strategy, so risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, slapped on that for a psychiatrist, they basically would have to they'd have to do a 180 for their practice, and all they'd have to focus on is offering esketamine, which made it really difficult to do. I'm hoping psilocybin follows a different path. We have Compass Pathways advancing these centers of excellence, and hopefully you have designated centers where doctors are incentivized enough to send their patients to those centers to receive therapy. And so I'm very hopeful of that. But the rollout will probably be complex, having these be very psychoactive, needing a clinician in place. You almost have to view it less as a prescription drug and almost more like a surgery in a way. If I'm going to go into the session for 7 hours, this is very intensive. And so the barriers to that, it's going to be pretty complex. And when you think about MDMA, last thought is that you have to get off SSRIs before you're going to use MDMA, that for PTSD. And so trying to find ways to bridge that gap is going to be very complex. And I think for doctors to feel as though that's de-risked enough, that getting someone off SSRIs and the value you have to go through there to get them to kind of, to the promised land of a therapy that's highly efficacious, you're going to have a hurdle to get over with people to get there. Now, we're invested in a company called Bionomics, which I think will help in bridging that gap. They're advancing a drug called BNC210, where it doesn't contraindicate with SSRIs, and they're hoping to sort of bridge that gap, eventually for MDMA therapy. And they're partnered with Empath Bio, which is an Atai subsidiary. But it's going to be complex. I do think, though, we will have a day where you go to your psychiatrist, you say, I'm depressed, and they say, hey, I've got the perfect drug for you. I'm going to write you a prescription for psilocybin therapy, and go, and they're cured and can live healthy, productive lives.
That's wonderful, brother, because as you know, for me, microdosing on psilocybin helped me get out of like a very nasty depression that I didn't even know I was depressed, right? It was like it wasn't until after the fact that I was like, oh shit, I was in a dark place.
I know.
So, and that
which also makes it more complex. Michael Pollan talks about the betterment of well people. There's people who probably don't have a formal diagnosis of depression, but I'm like, fuck, man, you could use some psilocybin. I'm talking to you right now. Like, I know you could just use a good trip. Like, you could just use like a good, just nuclear bomb to the brain, like nice oil change.
What's it called? Tim Ferriss calls it Control Alt Delete.
Defragging. Exactly. Just a nice reset. That's why
I love that.
Pharma, Stephen Ross. That's why they have the name. Reset.
This is a special round one that just came up for me. The question, just as you were talking about it, what's something that's obvious to you that is not obvious to the world that's going to happen in this space?
Two things. I think one, that 5-MeO-DMT, there's got to be something there. I think there's going to be high therapeutic efficacy around that drug. And it's not fully accepted, at least within the academic and research community, since it's so new, and they want to see enough data, and it's a bit more sclerotic. But I'm making a long-term anecdotal bet that there's going to be something around that compound that's incredibly effective. It's much shorter in duration of the trip, which makes it a lot more commercially viable. But I still think it will probably have high efficacy. So that's one. I'd say that probably not everyone sees it, because a lot of academics would maybe disagree with me or say jury's still out. The other, going back to your integration point, I think the other is probably that some of the oversight during the trip, at least the way we run it, is probably overrated. Of having two people in a room with the patient, I think we're going to migrate to a point where we don't necessarily need that. And Eleusis, another portfolio company of ours, is really doing some interesting work. So they own a chain of ketamine clinics called Calypso Ketamine, and they do much more of a control room model where the patient's in their own room with privacy, and they have a clinician in a sort of control room monitoring multiple patients at one time. And if someone has a bad trip or a bad experience, some troubling experience, there can be an emergency button or biometrics that inform the controller to come in and take care of the patient. But someone can actually be there in a bit more privacy. And I think for a lot of people, they sometimes want to go through their experience in private and not have someone there all the time. I don't think everyone wants someone there or two people that can be a little overbearing. And so I do see some more optionality emerging where if someone wants, a warm, cuddly psychotherapist there, they can have that. But if they don't, that option will become more available, and you'll still have therapeutic outcomes without that. And that'll make it a lot more commercially viable. That's not the standard view in the space. That's not the consensus view. I think consensus view is abundance of caution, have someone there. And I'm going a bit back on a statement I made earlier around that, but I think that'll open up a bit more.
That's great, Tim. And thank you so much. And that's all we got for today. Tim, thank you so much for coming on Mushroom Talk and speaking about all the things investment and the cultural movements. You brought a lot of insights. I hope our listeners will get some education and drop some knowledge. What would be the best way to follow you or your work or Palo Santo's work if anybody wants to reach out?
Twitter is Tim Schlidt. So just TIMSCHLIDT if you want to follow me on Twitter. But I'd say the biggest one is go to our website. Our website's just about to launch right now. We had been in stealth mode, but it is palosanto.vc. So PALOSANTO.vc, and check that out.
What a great name, man.
Yeah. No, it definitely speaks to the fact that we came from the underground. There's a ceremonial component to our own experiences that we really appreciate. And we're trying to bridge that gap between that and, advancing these in a commercial way, but also an ethical way.
That's awesome. Well, thanks, Tim. And we'll definitely have you back here for later in the episodes for next seasons when things start rocking and rolling in the industry, brother.
Yeah, would love to come back. Thanks.
Cheers.
All right, cheers.